Israel is directly supporting American strike on Venezuela. Israel's support for any potential or hypothetical United States military action against Venezuela cannot be understood by looking at Venezuela alone. It is rooted in a much broader web of global alliances, regional rivalries, ideological conflicts, and long-term security calculations that shape Israeli foreign policy. For Israel, Venezuela is not an isolated Latin American state, but part of a wider network of governments and movements that oppose the United States and Israel, and that align themselves with Israel's most serious adversaries, particularly Iran. From this perspective, Israel's position is not emotional or impulsive, but strategic, guided by its long-standing doctrine of neutralizing threats before they grow closer or stronger. At the center of this issue lies Israel's conflict with Iran. Iran has been Israel's most persistent and ideologically driven enemy for decades. Iranian leaders have repeatedly questioned Israel's legitimacy and have supported armed groups that actively fight Israel, such as Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Gaza. Israel views Iran's regional and global expansion as an existential threat. Because Iran faces heavy sanctions and pressure in the Middle East, it has sought allies far beyond its immediate neighborhood, including in Latin America. Venezuela, under the governments of Hugo Chavez and later Nicolas Maduro, became one of Iran's closest partners in the Western Hemisphere. This relationship included economic cooperation, political coordination, intelligence sharing, and alleged military and technological collaboration. For Israel, the idea of Iran gaining influence so close to the United States is deeply alarming, because it suggests that Iran could expand its operational reach, build logistics networks, and potentially threaten Israeli or Jewish interests abroad. Venezuela's relationship with Iran intensified largely because both countries positioned themselves as opponents of U.S. dominance. This shared anti-American stance created a natural partnership. Venezuela helped Iran circumvent sanctions through oil deals, financial channels, and transportation links. Iranian companies reportedly assisted Venezuela in repairing oil refineries and in setting up industries that could operate outside Western oversight. Israel interprets these developments not merely as economic cooperation, but as part of Iran's broader strategy to survive sanctions and project power globally. Therefore, when the United States takes a hard line against Venezuela, Israel sees it as a move that indirectly restricts Iran's ability to maneuver internationally. Another important factor is Israel's deep strategic alliance with the United States. Israel depends heavily on U.S. military aid, intelligence, cooperation, diplomatic protection, and technological collaboration. Over decades, Israel has aligned itself with U.S. foreign policy in most major global conflicts, especially those involving shared adversaries. Supporting U.S. pressure on Venezuela reinforces Israel's image as a reliable ally. From Israel's perspective, standing with the United States on Venezuela strengthens mutual trust and ensures continued U.S. support on issues that Israel considers far more critical, such as Iran's nuclear program, Hezbollah's missile arsenal, and conflicts involving Gaza and Syria. Venezuela's own stance toward Israel has also shaped Israeli attitudes. Over the years, Venezuelan leadership has been openly hostile toward Israel. Diplomatic relations were severed, Israeli military actions were harshly condemned, and Venezuela positioned itself as a vocal supporter of the Palestinian cause, often using strong language against Israel in international forums. Venezuelan leaders align themselves rhetorically and politically with groups and governments that oppose Israel. For Israel, this hostility removes any incentive to defend Venezuela against U.S. actions. Instead, Israel sees Venezuela as part of an ideological camp that seeks to challenge Israeli legitimacy and international standing. Israel's concerns are not limited to Iran alone. Venezuela has also developed close ties with Russia and China, both of which have complicated relationships with Israel. Russia cooperates closely with Iran in Syria, a country that borders Israel and hosts Iranian military assets. Although Israel maintains a cautious working relationship with Russia, it remains wary of Russian actions that empower Iran. China, meanwhile, has expanded its global influence and often supports positions critical of Israel in international institutions. Venezuela's alignment with Russia and China places it firmly within a bloc that challenges U.S. and Western influence. Any U.S. action that weakens this bloc indirectly benefits Israel by reducing the global leverage of actors that often side with Israel's enemies. The historical context of Israeli foreign policy is also relevant. Israel has long followed a security doctrine that emphasizes preemption and deterrence. Because of its small size and hostile regional environment, Israel believes it cannot afford to ignore distant threats that may eventually reach its borders. This mindset extends beyond the Middle East. Iranian activities in Latin America, Africa, and Asia are seen as part of a long-term strategy that could eventually be used against Israeli interests. Therefore, Israel supports actions that disrupt Iran's global networks, even if those actions occur thousands of kilometers away. In addition, Israel closely monitors the activities of militant organizations that it considers terrorist groups. There have been long-standing allegations, though often debated and difficult to verify publicly, that Iranian-backed networks operate in parts of Latin America, including fundraising, logistics, and recruitment activities. The memory of past attacks against Jewish targets in the region, such as bombings in Argentina in the 1990s, has left a deep imprint on Israeli security thinking. Venezuela's close ties with Iran raise fears that the country could serve as a safe environment for hostile networks. U.S. pressure on Venezuela is therefore seen by Israel as reducing the risk of such activities. Economic considerations also play a role, though they are secondary to security concerns. Israel is deeply integrated into the Western economic system, and benefits from global stability under U.S. leadership. Venezuela's defiance of sanctions regimes and its efforts to create alternative economic systems with Iran, Russia, and China challenge that order. Israel supports measures that reinforce sanctions and discourage states from forming economic blocs that bypass Western oversight, because such systems often enable Israelis' adversaries to survive and strengthen themselves. Another layer of this issue is ideological alignment. Venezuelan leadership under Chavez and Maduro embraced a revolutionary anti-imperialist ideology that framed the United States and Israel as symbols of global oppression. Israeli leaders view such rhetoric as dangerous because it fuels hostility and justifies violence against Israel and its allies. Supporting U.S. action against Venezuela is, in Israel's view, a way to push back against an ideological movement that legitimizes aggression toward Israel. It is also important to understand that Israel's support does not necessarily mean advocating for war or invasion. In many cases, support takes the form of diplomatic backing, intelligence sharing, or public alignment with U.S. statements. Israel often prefers pressure, sanctions, and isolation over direct military conflict, especially when it is not directly involved. By backing U.S. actions rhetorically, Israel aims to shape outcomes without becoming entangled in distant conflicts. Domestic politics within Israel also influence foreign policy positions. Israeli leaders are keenly aware of public perceptions regarding national security. Demonstrating toughness against Iran and its allies resonates with Israeli voters who prioritize security above most other issues. Supporting U.S. pressure on Venezuela can be framed domestically as part of the broader struggle against Iran, reinforcing the government's image as vigilant and proactive. From the U.S. perspective, Israeli support is valuable, symbolically, even if Israel does not play a direct operational role. It reinforces the narrative that Venezuela is isolated internationally and opposed by America's closest allies. Israel understands this dynamic and uses its diplomatic weight to strengthen alliances that it relies on in more immediate regional conflicts. It is also worth noting that international politics is rarely about moral judgments alone. Israel does not necessarily evaluate Venezuela primarily on its internal governance, economic crisis, or human rights record, although these issues are often cited by the United States. Instead, Israel evaluates Venezuela through the lens of strategic alignment. Because Venezuela aligns itself with Iran and other adversaries, Israel naturally supports measures that constrain Venezuelan power and influence. Critics argue that such positions contribute to global instability and that supporting U.S. pressure on Venezuela may worsen humanitarian suffering. Israeli policymakers are aware of these criticisms but tend to prioritize national security over distant humanitarian considerations, especially when the state in question is aligned with actors that threaten Israel's existence. This reflects a realist approach to international relations, where survival and deterrence outweigh moral concerns. Israelis' calculations are also influenced by precedent. In the past, states that provided support to Israel's enemies often became targets of international pressure, sanctions, or military action. Israel learned that early alignment with powerful allies helps shape outcomes more favorably by supporting U.S. actions against Venezuela. Israel positions itself firmly on the side of the dominant global power, reinforcing its own security guarantees. The broader Middle East context cannot be ignored either. Israel faces ongoing threats from Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, and potentially Iran itself. Any reduction in Iran's global capacity to fund, arm, or support its regional proxies is seen as a direct benefit to Israeli security. Even if U.S. actions against Venezuela do not immediately affect the Middle East, they may strain Iran's resources and attention, which Israel views as advantageous. Another subtle factor is intelligence cooperation. Israel and the United States share intelligence on global threats, including Iranian activities. Venezuela's role in facilitating Iranian operations makes it an area of shared concern. Supporting U.S. actions ensures continued access to intelligence and coordination that Israel considers essential for anticipating and countering threats. In summary, Israel's support for U.S. strikes or pressure on Venezuela is driven by a complex combination of strategic, ideological, and security considerations. It is less about Venezuela's internal politics and more about Venezuela as alliances and symbolism within a global struggle involving the United States, Iran, Russia, and China. For Israel, supporting U.S. action against Venezuela fits into a broader strategy of countering Iran, strengthening ties with Washington, discouraging hostile alliances, and maintaining a global order that favors its own survival and security. This position reflects Israel's long-standing approach to foreign policy, where distant events are evaluated through the lens of existential threats and long-term strategic balance, rather than geographic proximity or immediate economic interest.